With the reveal of the brand new critical Sentinel triggers, we as deck builders have a lot more decisions to make in regarding which cards will make it and which card won't make the cut in our decks. But is that a good thing or is that actually a bad thing? That's what we're discussing today.
Stand up! Vanguard!
One of the main appeals of a TCG is the deck building aspect, where we as a player are putting cards together in our deck to make a functioning, playable strategy and then use it in battle in what type of game we're actually playing. And per game, there are some restrictions in place regarding deck building to not be able to abuse certain cards or at least give some variety to builds. And in Vanguard, there are a couple of simple restrictions in place. We can only put 4 copies of a card in the deck with the same name, and a deck can only contain 50 cards, from which 16 always need to be triggers. And within those 16, only a maximum of 4 can be heal triggers. But besides that, that's basically everything concerning your deck building. How many grade 3s you want to run, or grade 2s or grade 1s, do you want to run extra normal grade 0s, that's all up to us. But if we take a look at premium, we also have the G zone that can be a maximum of 16 G units that can either be G cards or just normal strides. It doesn't really matter for that fact. But in Vanguard, there is a extra restriction in place concerning a very special type of cards, and these are the Sentinels. And these specific cards allows us to only put a maximum of 4 Sentinels in the entire deck. And it doesn't matter if they have different names or different type of abilities. A total of 4 cards with the Sentinel keyword can be put in one singular deck at the same time. And per usual, these Sentinels are very high defensive cards. We have the normal Perfect Guard that can block out any attack for just discarding a card from our hand. We have the old Quintet the Wall that for a counterblast checks the top 5 cards and you call those to the Guardian Circle for your guard value. But now with the latest edition, we also have these Crit Sentinel Triggers, which are 30k shield on a singular card. And because all these cards share a specific restriction that we can only put a maximum of 4 cards in the deck, it brings an interesting decision to the table when concerning deck building, as within Vanguard we have 2 types of main focuses. We have the main deck and we have our trigger zone, which all have questions of which cards we want to run and what type of distribution between grades and specific cards themselves. And because now with the Sentinel restriction going cross-platform, you could say, between the trigger lineup and the normal lineup, there are a lot of interesting questions and decisions to make, as do I want to run the grade 1 Perfect Guard? Do I want to run the draw Perfect Guard? And now with the Crit Sentinel, there's even more questions and decisions to make, as do I want to be able to run more than 8 crits or maybe up to 16 crits within some builds, but am I willing to sacrifice a potential to block out any powerful attack? Or can I not afford to discard more cards, or can I not afford to run excessive amount of grade 1 PGs because all my grade 1 slots are filled? And also draw triggers don't really help with my engine or with my strategy, so do I then want to run this extra 30k shield? So a actual hard limit on cards themselves that are then shared in one singular pool makes a lot of interesting decisions arise out of nowhere. Because if these cards didn't have these type of restrictions, there was a highly likely chance that either normal Perfect Guard would have been run in a much higher lineup than just 4 cards, or in the case of the new Critical Sentinel, these will just be splashed in any deck, because the 30k shield on just a crit trigger is just so much better than a normal 15k shield crit that those cards would be replaced instantly. So this type of restriction could be put in place to allow card designers to design a very powerful type of set of cards in a specific scenario. This could be aggressive cards, this could be consistency cards, this could even be some type of special drive checking cards. But if you could limit those cards to an X amount of cards in a deck total, then you're free to build or release a lot of these type of cards, and you don't have to be afraid that these will clutter any type of decks or they will outvalue any normal cards that you release in any other set that is in that specific set or follows that set. And personally, I like this type of restriction because unironically it opens way more deck building options and strategies, because for one, the card developers are now inclined to create more powerful cards, as they can just do that because maybe they limit that specific card to only 4 copies, maybe 3 copies, 2 copies, or 1 copy per deck. So there is a less likely chance that these cards would get abused. And this way, because maybe you have a, let's say, an aggro, instead of a Sentinel keyword, we have an aggro keyword, and that's limited to 1 copy. So we can only put 1 special aggro card in our deck, but we have like 10 different aggro cards in our clan. That basically gives a lot of choices as, do I want to run card X or card Y or card B or card Alpha? Because you can only run 1 typic card, there is a lot of choices and things to consider when picking a singular specific card. And if all these cards wouldn't have that type of restriction, then it was highly likely chance that like 5 or maybe all of them would just put instantly into your deck. And because they just hard limit or hard restrict these cards in a specific way, then that will bring a lot more interesting choices to deck building, even though usually restricting deck building in some kind of capacity is usually tend to be frowned upon. But in this case, I think this would be more interesting, because they can then, for that reason, design way more interesting cards and powerful cards because they are just limited. But Bushiroad also used a different strategy, and this has been seen in the G era, because G Guardians are somewhat in the same vein as Sentinels, as they have a usage restriction instead of an actual deck restriction. As you can only use a G Guard if you have 3 or less copies face up in your G zone. Meaning, after the 4th one, they basically become useless and you cannot use them anymore. But because they aren't restricted in your deck themselves, you can play like 7 different G Guards or 7 total of G Guards, and then on the fly decide which you want to use. And this is a very interesting concept, because this allows you to basically put multiple cards of a very powerful type in your build, but after an X amount of usages, you can no longer utilize them. And this also brings an interesting aspect to deck building, as now you not necessarily are limited to an X amount of cards, but you're arrived to the question, do I want to run just the safe amount of that X amount of copies, or am I willing to run a little bit more so I have more usage or more options on the fly? But at a certain point, if the game is prolonged to a certain amount, or I blasted through my cards way too fast, then I might have an X amount of dead cards that are no longer useful to me because their skills are offline, as I already used the maximum amount of that type of card. And in some strategies, this could be abused, and some strategies don't. And also some players like this type of playstyle where they just go overboard with these type of cards and just see it on the fly what they can do, and others will just stay safe and put themselves at the maximum capacity, and in some cases maybe under that maximum capacity because they just don't have the room for that specific card. Either restrictions are interesting in their own right, as one brings more interesting decisions during the deck development stage, and the other does it in some regards, but it gives you a little bit more flexibility, but then allows you to experiment more on the fly while playing the actual game. So far in Standard, we only saw this experimentation with hard restriction on deck building with the new versions of the normal Sentinel types. We have the Grade 1 Sentinel PG, we have the Grade 0 Draw Sentinel PG, and we now have the Grade 0 Critical Sentinel 30k Shield card. And I'm personally very interested if they are going to experiment or going to branch out on this type of deck building restriction or this deck building approach, where we as players are forced to either inherit a certain rule in the deck building aspect directly, or maybe in a playstyle directly like that we have with G Guardians. I honestly hope that they're going to do this more often, as this brings a lot more interesting decisions to the game itself, as because we are restricted to some kind of ruling that is outside the main rules that are just 50 cards, 16 triggers, 4 heals, that kind of stuff, which in itself will then brings a lot of interesting discussion to the table, like this video for example, that then can translate it in so many other different aspects that will have ripple effects throughout the game itself. But of course, this is something that needs to be done carefully, because if they just make random restrictions on certain type of skills that doesn't make any sense, that could have negative impact. Also, they could go a little bit overboard, and because they think, alright, these cards are just restricted to an X amount of cards per deck, we can make them a lot stronger, and maybe they go a bit overboard and make them too strong. But I'm honestly curious of what your guys' opinions are around deck building restrictions that we have with Sentinel. So I put up a poll above here where I asked the question of, are you in favor of this type of restriction or not? And what type of restriction? Because we have the G-Guardian type of restriction where we can only play an X amount of cards, but we can put as much type of cards in our deck as we want, but then we as players can basically put that cards in our deck. Or we have the direct hard limit of putting X amount of cards in our deck, like what we see with Sentinels or heal triggers, for example, as well. Because this is something that differs quite a lot per player. Some people like the fact that they are limited in their deck options, because this makes deck building to some capacity a little bit easier on the basic levels, unless you go to the next level, as I explained in this video, and you start seeing the intricate interactions between certain cards. Then you suddenly see that because of these limitations, there are countless more decisions to make. Or are you in favor that this actually makes deck building a lot interesting because of those extra interactions that will arise if you go into the nitty and gritty of every single thing? So I'm very interested in your guys' opinion on this specific subject, and of course we'll go over the general reactions and statistics in the next week's discussion once I've gathered all the results of the poll and your comments down below. Last time I discussed the trial decks for Tri-3, the one for Chronojet, Arsha, and Altmau, and basically went over what was the best trial deck of this support set. And honestly, I was more in favor of Arsha and Altmau for being the better trial deck, and sadly Chronojet is basically falling to the wayside, and your guys' opinion is basically the exact same thing as I had, where you guys put Arsha on the #1 spot, closely followed by Altmau, and Chronojet is way behind. And there are still votes for Chronojet Dragon, and it might be surprising as a lot of people, myself included, put the deck on a low value. But there are some things from the Chronojet trial deck that gives it some value. Stroboscope Dragon, for example, is such a generic card that will always be useful no matter if you're a budget player, maybe you want to have some extra controls, and it might not be used right now, but because it's so generic, it could definitely see place in maybe a future build, because getting control in force is never a bad thing. And also, Chronojet Dragon himself is a very solid card, because it can be a solid finisher in whatever type of build you want to play, but I will go over that in a future video once we start winding up all the information for the next stage booster set. But with Arsha and Altmau, it's very obvious that these are on the top and almost at the same value, because you can basically make an argument for both trial decks why they should be the best out of the three, because they both are very solid in their own respect. And with how the new support is shaping up from the next stage extra booster set, there is honestly a lot of interesting changes that might come to this table, because next week I will go over the next stage booster set, which clan might be the best that will come on top of that set, and it might be surprising what my opinion will be, but that's for next week. But that's basically everything for today. Let me know in the comments down below what your opinion is about restricting deck building in a certain way with specific powerful cards that are themselves restricted to an X amount of copies in your deck, or to a play restriction like G-Guards, where you can only play an X amount of cards until they go offline for the rest of the game. There are a lot of interesting things to discuss in the topic, so let me know in the comments down below, and I will probably highlight the most interesting one in next week's episode, and as well vote in a poll, as that poll results will also be discussed. This video has been brought to you by our lovely Patreons over at patreon.com/VanguardInsider. You guys are amazing. If you still want to support the channel or everything that's happening on the channel, then head over to patreon.com/VanguardInsider and become a Patreon today. But with that said, I'm Mr. Timely, and I see you guys in the next one!